also about the cross, that both go together, that both are essential to our understanding of Jesus, his life, and his ministry. And what's important about this, too, is when we think about being a disciple of Jesus and following Jesus, we're not just talking about believing with lip service and going to church and doing these things, but actually living like Jesus. Talked about it this morning, too. One of the things I talked about this morning, and the reason we have these pictures up, I talked about this with kids this morning, is this was not just something God thought up one day and said, let's try this. But that since the beginning, since Genesis, since the creation of people and the separation of people from God, this has been God's plan. The miraculous birth, the resurrection. And so for us who believe, if you are a Christian, if you would say you are a Christian, we must see both together and their importance, both the birth of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus. And all the elements of Jesus' birth in the middle that teach us and lead us and guide us. You know, we don't often think about this, but the intensely difficult circumstances of Jesus' life that were intentional so that you and I, no matter what our background, could identify with Jesus. Jesus was born to a teen mom in a very difficult circumstance. Jesus was a refugee. Many people forget that part of the story. After the Magi came, Jesus and his family had to flee to Egypt for persecution and violence. He came from a small town that people didn't think very much of. And yet, because even in the midst of all of that difficulty, he became a great teacher. He became an advocate for the poor, for the lowly, for the immigrant, for those suffering. And in his death, the story of his death, at the end of his life, you would think someone who could perform miracles and had all these followers would have a better story than this. But no, at the end of his life, he was rejected. He was hurt by those closest to him. Rejected by his own people and contemporaries, other teachers. Even after loving and serving everyone, they turned on him. And it's amazing because the life of Jesus is not just the miraculous birth and the resurrection, but it's the middle parts. And the reason it's so powerful to me is that because of those middle parts, I can identify with this Jesus. He didn't have a perfect life. He didn't walk around floating on a cloud. Many of us know what it's like to come from difficult circumstances. Many of us know what it's like to be rejected. Many of us know what it's like to be turned away by people we loved and thought were there for us. And at Christmas, we are reminded of his life and his death, and it highlights the struggles of Jesus, but then Christmas also has a weird way of highlighting our own struggles, doesn't it? Maybe we don't have enough to get the things we want to get for the people we love. Maybe this Christmas time highlights broken relationships and things we used to have. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's personal, maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's spiritual emptiness. But Christmas sort of highlights our own brokenness too, doesn't it? It shows us the life of Jesus and how it was far from perfect, but then it also kind of shows us sometimes, even if we don't want it to, and reminds us that our life's not perfect. And this is why I think it's so important that we set aside time like this each year and celebrate the miraculous birth of Jesus, because it identified our God to us. That God became like us, his creation. God entered into humanity, became a person, lived, breathed, had joys, had hurts, had success, had failures and rejections. God lived the human experience through Jesus. Your experience. That when you feel like no one understands, no one's ever gone through this, no one will understand, that Christ understands. That was the whole point. And when we look at this, when we think about this, we realize that this is the story of all people. The story of the Bible, the story of Jesus, it is the story of all people, that we all suffer, we all struggle, we all have difficult circumstances and hard times in our lives. But what matters is what do we do about it? I don't know if you know this or have thought about it, but did you know that human beings, regardless of how you think and who created us, I believe God created human beings to worship, and that all humanity for all time has worshiped something? Doesn't matter what culture, what society, way back in the past, all human beings worship something. All humanity was designed to worship. And so if we don't worship God, then we worship other things, don't we? Right? And I sometimes think about this, and my wife and I will joke about this. If God wasn't God, who would we worship? Like, what would we worship? We sort of joke about it. We both love being warm, so I get it. People worship the sun. That makes sense to me. We would worship the sun god, right? That's my favorite. If you think about maybe you've ever been outside in a really bad monsoon, you think in a lightning storm, you're like, I get why people worshiped the sky and lightning and thunder. This is terrifying, right? Maybe it's a modern thing. You think of, what would I worship? Like, what would be my biggest thing? Maybe it's power, maybe it's money, maybe it's success, maybe it's influence. What would you worship? What would you go after with your life? And many people live their lives that way. Rather than submitting to God or worshiping a God who loves them, what they try to do is pursue other things and make other things gods. We know that. And they go after things that give power and money and influence. And they end up worshiping things that are powerful. But Christmas, and this is what's so amazing to me about the God of the Bible, is that Christmas isn't about power. Christmas isn't terrifying display of power. Christmas is about a God who knows us, who identifies with us, who knows you, who loves you, who comes into your life and offers a new life, to have freedom from all that junk that causes pain and suffering. That's what the birth and the death and resurrection of Jesus does. It shows us Jesus' life, but then through his life and through his death and resurrection, we know that we are offered a new life. That is why Jesus came, that you and I, that anyone who believes in him would have new life. See, Jesus didn't come to demand worship of people. Jesus came to serve people and give them the choice. Listen, you can follow me. You can live a new life. You can have a better life, a more fulfilling, deep, rich, spiritual life. But he doesn't coerce, he doesn't force, he doesn't prove. Christmas is not about power. Christmas is about love and service. And that is what Jesus came to give, the ultimate gift of a new life, a whole life, a joy-filled, deep spiritual life. And I would actually argue that this is what the world is looking for. This is what the world wants, a life of deep spiritual significance. Because many people have wealth, have possessions, have comfort. We have homes, we have heating, we have cooling, we have all of these wonderful things in our life. We have possessions and all the stuff. Humanity's curing diseases, and we're flying into space, and we have super fast computers in our pockets, and we have so many things that are so good, and yet so many people are still suffering and struggling. So many people want deep spiritual significance. So many people are suffering from an epidemic of loneliness in our world today. And you go to the bookstore, you go down the street, right down here to Barnes & Noble, and you look at books, and you will find that most of them are about what? Identity, suffering, finding your purpose, why things happen in life, what is the meaning of life, why do bad things happen? All of these things that Jesus came to address, and everyone is looking everywhere else for them. There's a director at George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Health, and she said this: spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way their experience and their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significance or sacred. What she says and what she's getting at is that this is a piece of us that we need. That spirituality is how we connect. Spirituality is how we learn. Spirituality is how we find meaning and purpose in this life. You can have the world's greatest job, but if you don't connect with it on a spiritual level, it's going to feel empty. You can have all the possessions of the world and live in the dream house with the dream car, but you will feel empty because you are a spiritual being. And if that spiritual need in your life is not being met, you will feel empty, you will feel lonely, you will be longing. And what I love about Jesus, and the reason I do this as a job and I became a pastor, was because I believe that Jesus answered all of these questions. I believe that the life after Jesus answers all of these questions, that being a disciple and a follower of Jesus gives me meaning and depth to my life in a way that nothing else I've seen does. And many of you know what I'm talking about because you've pursued other things, and those things have left you empty and wanting. But this is the fear, right? We talk about Jesus, we talk about the birth and death and resurrection of Jesus, and the fear is, yes, but what if it's not true? What if it's a lie? What if I'm made a fool? And I get it. So what do? We kind of do 1 foot in, 1 foot out. We explore, we investigate, we think about it, right? Just easier to put 1 foot in the pool instead of just jumping into the deep end. And so we go to church occasionally, we read spiritual books occasionally, we read the Bible occasionally. But this is the thing about following Jesus. He doesn't force it on us, but let me just give you a heads up. Following Jesus is not part-time. Being a Christian is not when it's convenient. Having a new life that Jesus offers us, having a new life that Jesus offers us is not something we can just hop in and out of. The new life in Jesus, the new life that Jesus offers all of us is about following him with everything we are, his life, his teachings, and digging deeper into that spiritual commitment we've been longing for. Now, when I say new life, sometimes people think, okay, so what does that mean? I have to abandon everything? I have to get rid of everything? I have to bail on all of this? I'm not saying that. You don't need to change your hair, move to a new state. That's not what a new life is. What I mean is what the Apostle Paul says to the church in Colossae, in the book of Colossians. He talks about taking off the old self and putting on Christ. Taking off the stuff of your life that you don't like, that brings turmoil, that brings pain, that brings hurt, and putting on the things of Christ to become a person that is more reliable, more trustworthy, more honest, more loving, more caring, more self-sacrificing to the people around us we love the most. Take off the old stuff that hasn't been working and put on Jesus. Now, let me be clear about a couple of things here. One, sometimes we know that things are bad or lead to bad consequences, right? And sometimes it's really obvious. So when I talk about putting off the old self and the new life in Jesus, yeah, there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's bad choices. We get a lot of that stuff, and we know that stuff is bad for us. But what about stuff that isn't so black and white? I talk with people about this a lot, actually. And they'll come in and we'll talk, or I'll share life with people, and they'll sort of give me a history of their life following Jesus and what it's looked like. And they'll say, gosh, I just don't get it. I just am not where I thought I'd be. I just don't have that deep faith I see in other people or whatever it is. And I wonder this sometimes, and I hope you hear me when I say this, but sometimes the old stuff we need to put off is the same way we've always done religion in church. The same way we've always believed, because we've never actually thought critically about it. We've just gone along to get along and kept a foot in the pool and gone to church a couple of times a year and just kind of done whatever the minimum is. You ever thought about that? What if the same way I've always believed? What if church isn't working and it's not meeting my deep spiritual needs? See, what happens when that happens is we actually blame God or we blame Jesus rather than thinking critically about what we might be doing wrong. Maybe we need to pull apart some of the things we're doing in life and see why Christ is not meeting our needs. I just want to say this really bluntly to all of us. If your life, when you talk about your spiritual life, your church life, whatever, if your life is not reflecting love and joy, then it's probably not Jesus. If your spiritual life is not loving and serving the people around you, it's probably more a creation of man than of Jesus. And what Jesus says to all of us is if we look at our lives and the things that are coming out, the fruit in our life is not what we want, then he offers a new life, that we can exchange that stuff for the stuff that brings deep enrichment. So is your spiritual life, you as a human being, I can't answer it for you, is your spiritual life loving and serving others and full of grace? If the answer is no, then you might need more Jesus. Not more church, necessarily. Not more the way you've always done it, but stop and be deeply introspective and think, what does this new life in Jesus actually look like? And have I just been going through motions for a really long time? Sometimes I would even argue with people that we need to pull apart our old life and look at what it did to us, what our traditions, what our desires, what our choices, all of the past life when we don't feel fulfilled and we don't feel close to Jesus, what that life was like and what it did and how it affected us, and how it actually led us away from Jesus. We know poor choices can lead us away from Jesus, but did you know that sometimes the way we practice church and do other things can actually lead us away and let us down? That sometimes because of our past and our history, and some of you, by the way, have serious hurts from church. We don't need to have people raise their hands, but I know a lot of people I talk to who really struggle with church because church has hurt them dearly. And we end up blaming God for that. And maybe because of our experiences, we think that God doesn't actually love us. Maybe all of this stuff is true. Maybe Jesus was born and died and resurrected. But you know what? Your experience says that God doesn't actually love you that much, so you've chosen to run away from that. Maybe that's not God. Maybe that's people and how communities around you have acted and behaved. But did you know, if you read through this book, there is nowhere in here that says God loves you any less. There is nowhere in here that says that there's like a first-place Christian team and a second-place Christian team and a third-place Christian team, and there's these superstar Christians and then these really, really bad Christians that just barely make it. No, it says we're all the same and that God loves us. God has never said to you that he loves you less. And in fact, the story of Jesus, every single Christmas reminds us of how much he loves us, that God entered in, became a person, and entered into all the stuff we go through so that we could identify with him. And this God loves you so much that he doesn't limit your access to a new life. That this new life, this gift of Christmas, brings us the ultimate meaning and a deep spiritual significance that, like I said, I think everyone on the planet is looking for. I really do. You know, some of you might know the name Rainn Wilson. Rainn Wilson played Dwight Schrute on The Office. And he is a really spiritual guy. And I don't agree with everything he says, but one of the things he talks about after his life story is that young people today have thrown out the spiritual baby with the religious bathwater. Meaning that because people are so against religion, they've thrown out this spiritual component of their lives, and they've just said, you know what, I'm not spiritual, that stuff doesn't matter, all that matters is this life now. Friends, following a life like that will lead to a lot of pain and emptiness because you are a spiritual being. You were designed to worship something. And maybe what it looks like when you think about a new life with Jesus, maybe what that means is taking time this Christmas, thinking about the truth of Christmas, the truth of Jesus' birth and life and death and resurrection, and thinking, I need to go more towards that. I need to go more towards Jesus. I need to read this book and see what Jesus said and actually did and see how I need to live my life and find that new life Jesus offers. You know, we've been given an opportunity. Every single day we're given an opportunity for a new life of love and worship. A life of humility and service to one another that models the life of Christ. A new life that gives us meaning and depth. Because, friends, you need to know that your life is not small and insignificant. So many of us, whether we feel lonely, we're struggling, we have difficult, whatever it is, we feel like our lives are small and insignificant because, well, it's just a human life. It's a blip on the radar. What difference could it make? But friends, our lives are not small because Christ came and lived life just like us, and his life was not small. His life meant everything. And so too does yours. Your life can have profound, deep impact in the life of another. And so, when you think about new life, when you think about Christmas, when you think about the birth of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus, his whole life story, if you believe it, and if you believe there is new life available to you, it's up to you to walk into it. It's up to you to choose it. It's up to you to go forward in it. It's up to you to stop and get away from sometimes all the religious tradition, all the ways we've always done it, and stop and look and say, what did Jesus actually say? What did Jesus actually do? And that's how I want to live. And look for the deep, spiritual, meaningful significance you've been looking for there and find that new life Christ offers. Would you pray with me?